Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us here for this conversation on suicide and suicide prevention, bringing those conversations into the workplace. I'm Luca Oak. I am in organizational and professional development. I work as a strategic advisor and coach for leaders in for-profit and nonprofit organizations. I am a passionate advocate for mental health, and I'm really, really honored to be part of this conversation. We are going to get right into it. We have a lot to cover and limited time to do so. Before I do that, though, just a bit of housekeeping logistics. This conversation we hope it will be very empowering and enabling for many folks. We also recognize that it could be impactful and it could be emotionally activating for folks. So we do have a timeout room for anyone who needs to step out of the conversation and have a moment with a counselor. You can go there into the timeout room, and you can have a conversation with a counselor that is completely confidential. You do that within the platform. If there's anyone who needs help making that shift into the timeout room, please send a message in chat, and someone will be able to support you. So with that in mind, I'd like to get right into introducing my fellow panelists. They are Brian Pinkerton of the United States Army Reserve. Brian has been the Suicide Prevention Program Manager for the 4th Sustainment Command Expeditionary since 2016. And his goal is to end suicide by facilitating a cultural shift that embraces help-seeking behavior and promotes overall well-being. Welcome, Brian. So glad to have you. Gavin Alexander of Jackson Lewis. Gavin is an attorney and a certified corporate wellness specialist. He's at a law firm with more than 950 attorneys and 60 offices around the US. And before joining the firm, Gavin served as the first ever fellow of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court Standing Committee on Lawyer Wellbeing. Welcome, Gavin. Great to be with you. Debbie Schwartz of Marshall McClellan. Oh my goodness. Debbie, I practiced that, I promise you, and it's still just not coming off the tongue. So let's try that again. Debbie Schwartz of Marsh McClellan. Debbie works, I'm just going to call it MMA now. Debbie works with MMA in Florida in financial planning and analysis, and feels quite fortunate to be able to work at an organization that is very active in promoting understanding and support around mental health. And Debbie came to understand the importance of mental health at a young age after watching family members struggle with addiction and a variety of emotional challenges. Welcome, Debbie. Thanks, and really glad to have you here. And Christina Ewing of Anderson Construction. After 12 years leading the finance department for Anderson Construction, I love this story, Christina. Christina recognized an organizational gap in the well-being space and asked to be given the opportunity to fill that gap. After being given the green light for that, Christina took on the challenge of creating a department that didn't previously exist and becoming the Director of Health and Wellbeing for the organization. Way to completely change an organization and directly impact the lives of folks. Christina, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Luca.
Alrighty, I want to settle just a tiny bit of context before I open up the conversation. I was supposed to be in my home office in Monterey, California. Instead, I'm at my family home in the Mojave Desert in California, because my father passed away last Tuesday. My father was a 80-year-old combat veteran. He had a long life, and he was able to die. He was very fortunate being able to die peacefully in his home with his family, folks who loved him. But he could have certainly had a much more sort of misfortunate way out of the world. And so, watching sort of his mental health challenges over the years, and knowing that there's so many challenges related to the military. Brian, I think, I sort of come to you first. Something I wanted to happen this week, and I wanted to share with you. I went to call the veterans support line that provides insurance. And it turns out when I was on hold, I heard the message, if you need to reach an insurance agent, press 1. And if you are having thoughts of suicide, press 7. And I thought, wow, even when you're just doing something as simple and straightforward as calling about insurance, there's constantly sort of messages around suicide prevention in the military. So Brian, I'm wondering if you could get us started with talking about cultural change. I know that there's cultural change necessary across all kinds of organizations, and certainly this is the case with the military. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to the need for cultural change when it comes to behavioral health and how you're working to facilitate that change in the military.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. The Army has identified that there is a need to move from the way that they used to do things to the way they should do things, and they haven't gotten there yet, but they are doing it by creating these initiatives that promote wellness in general. They have developed a program that's based on positive psychology called Master Resiliency Training, and it deals with various aspects of overall well-being, and they incorporate well-being in every aspect of what they are doing, so it is becoming a part of their culture, and you can see these things in almost every aspect of the things that the Army does. And it is incorporated throughout the various services and the Veterans Administration, uh, from those ubiquitous signs of the crisis line. You'll
Mm-hmm.
see the number 988, which you can dial at any time to get the international or to get the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. When you call that number, you'll hear an automated message that says, if you're in crisis, please stay on the line and a crisis worker will be with you. If you are a veteran or military member, please press 1. The same message that you heard. And so
Mm-hmm.
a big part of what they're doing is just ensuring that um, there are discussions that are being held about wellness, about behavioral health and mental health, about suicidality. And they do not shy away from using those terms. In the past, the stigma has prevented people from saying words like suicide because of a variety of different reasons, but it all comes down to the stigma associated with it. And the more those conversations are had, the more those words are spoken, the more familiar people become with it, and the more likely they are to talk about it. So that is the foundation of the change that is taking place, that they are bringing about to create a culture where people feel like it is safe to say, I need help. And that is the primary aspect of the change that we are initiating, is a culture that accepts that behavioral health is just as much a part of our reality, a part of our norm as physical health. And so
Absolutely.
that's where we stand right now.
Absolutely. That's really so. There are a couple of things that it's really powerful to hear, and there's a couple of things I take away from that I would summarize and sort of offer for other organizations. One is ensuring that there's visibility and language that promotes the reality of mental health. You know that there is this reality of mental health challenges. So let's use that language and let's have that visibility for those mental health challenges, and then ensuring that there are resources so that folks know where to go if they are having these challenges. They know what numbers to call, they know who they can talk to, and they have sort of the language to talk about what's challenging them. So I think those are the three things I heard: sort of that visibility, that language, and then those resources across an organization like the military. So thank you for sharing that, Brian. That's incredibly helpful.
Luca, if I may, there's one more aspect to it that we
Sure.
spend a lot of time and effort on, and that is having those individual conversations to identify when somebody may be struggling with some life event, and to go to them and say, I see that you're struggling, and I want you to know that I'm a safe place. And are you thinking about suicide? And we incorporate that into a variety of different trainings and encourage people to have those conversations and to be on the lookout for those who may need to have that question asked.
Very powerful, very powerful. That actually, I think, takes us right into Gavin. those individual conversations. Are you considering suicide? I'm a safe place. I think, Gavin, a lot of your work has been around ensuring that at an individual level we are able to folks are able to connect and understand each other as being a safe place and being a resource. Gavin, I think I heard your story when we were preparing for this session, and I actually physically remember getting chills as I listened to you talk about your story. Can you just share a little bit about your personal story and just one thing that really stood out? You talked about how it was easier to talk about your sexual identity than it was to talk about suicide individually and to have that conversation individually with folks. So can you just talk a little bit about what that story is, and how do you think it finally shifted for you to be able to have those individual conversations?
Yeah, thank you so much, Luca, and thank you, Brian, as well, and thank you to all the panelists and This Can Happen for organizing all of this. I think my story in many ways is the lesson that Brian spoke about and that the Army is tackling now, which is and as you said, Luca, I felt comfortable coming out as bisexual when I was 16. I didn't feel comfortable admitting to a single other human being that I thought I was suffering from symptoms of depression until I was 30. And because all of that waiting was because of the stigma, because no one was talking about it, and because I didn't see leaders in the positions I aspired to sharing that they'd been through anything similar, or that they'd struggled with their mental health, or actually gotten support. So because I waited so long, things got to a crisis point for me. And in my fourth year of practice, I attempted to end my own life while I was a corporate associate at a giant law firm. And I talk about that openly and honestly now because I want more people to talk about the fact that we have been through things like this. The fact that I tried to end my life, I tried to die by suicide. And I talk about that because exactly as Brian said, the more we talk about it, the more likely it is that if someone is struggling, if someone is starting to have those feelings and starting to be on that spectrum of what we call suicidal ideation, right? Everything from those fleeting thoughts of, it'd be just a little easier not to live today, all the way to, I have a plan and I'm going to execute it this afternoon. All of those people should have a place to go to where they can say, I'm going through this and I need help. And whether that is 988 or someone internally to an organization, or obviously a medical care provider, a mental health care provider, all of those resources are available. But for so many, they don't see anyone out there talking about, I have been through this too. And they especially don't see leaders saying, I have gone to therapy, I have gone on antidepressants, someone in my life very dear to me attempted to end their life, and or did succeed in dying by suicide, and here's how it impacted me, and here's how I'm fighting to stop that in the future. So I share my story, and by sharing my story is how I wound up doing the work I'm doing now as a full-time wellness director and advocate for lawyer mental health and well-being.
Yeah, very powerful. I take away one thing that I actually haven't heard before, which I think is really important, is this notion of a spectrum of suicidal ideation. That let's not wait until we're at the point where we're steps away from committing the act. Just even thinking about if you hear someone say, maybe I should have just not even stayed here after college, or maybe the world would be better off without me. This one I've heard quite often from folks. Maybe everyone would be better off without me. It's just sort of immediately recognizing, hey, that might be someone on the spectrum of suicidal ideation. And so even having this as a phrase, the spectrum of suicidal ideation, I think is a really amazing contribution. Gavin, you just are just dropping bombs. Like every time I have 5 minutes with you and you're just dropping bombs. So thank you so much for that. I think that's really important. I want us to hold on to that notion of a spectrum of suicidal ideation, and let's not wait till crisis.
Yeah, and very quickly, just adding to that, not to catastrophize even the small end of that, or the lesser end of that spectrum. I am very much going to therapy on antidepressants, and I'm an active wellness practitioner. That doesn't mean I have cured my diagnosis of chronic depression and that there are never moments where I feel suicidal ideation. There are days where I wake up and think, you know what, it'd be easier not to live anymore. And that's okay. And part of talking about these conversations is when you're not at the end of the spectrum where you've got a plan and you're going to execute it this afternoon, sometimes we just need spaces to go and say, here's what I'm feeling today. I'm not going to do anything about it, but I'm feeling it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because being able to say that actually then is the first step in processing, getting the support, getting the connection, the help that we need. Absolutely, absolutely. And speaking of that, Debbie, I want to move to you. Sort of talking about that personal experience and removing the stigma. Um, I was really struck by your story as well, and sort of how long you carried stigma, and that it was indeed actually the workplace that helped you move through that and move beyond that stigma. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I lost my mother back in 1995, 27 years ago, to suicide. And at the time, I mean, aside from the horrific act of having to suffer through losing a loved one, especially a parent to suicide, I found myself just completely ashamed at the prospect of sharing that with anybody publicly, like at work or friends, even. And really, only my family knew the truth. And so all these years, I've really never talked about it with anybody outside my family. I joined my current employer, Marsh McLennan Agency, back in the end of July. And quite soon after, I saw on the intranet they were doing, for Suicide Awareness Month, they were doing a suicide walk in honor of a colleague they lost to suicide. And his whole story was there. And that just sort of opened the floodgates for me, quite honestly. And I thought, gosh, this company's raising money and walking in the name of a colleague that they lost to suicide, and they're openly talking about it on their intranet site. And I thought, gosh, I'm just so touched by that. And then I came across This Can Happen Global, this wonderful organization, and I attended a webinar, and I wrote to Zoe, sent her a note afterward, and we got to talking. And all of a sudden, I just thought, gosh, in order to be authentic, which is a word we talk about often in today's day and age, I am very much a champion of mental health, very, very much an advocate for it. But how can I not talk about my own story if I'm such an advocate for that? So in order to be my authentic self, I began talking about it. I shared it, obviously, with Zoe and some of you, and shared it with a couple of HR leaders at my company, and they were just overwhelmed with emotion and just very proud that I came out and talked about it. And they were so pleased and inspired that I was doing this talk today. So at the time that it happened 27 years ago, the thought of talking about this at work, I mean, never, ever, ever, ever would I have thought that would be the case. So the fact that I'm here today, I've come a long way. So I feel very good. And the prospect of being able to help anyone who is in a similar position, that's really my goal.
Yeah, that is a right on time comment. The prospect of being able to help anyone is really your goal, because we have a question in chat. This comes from our audience. I think a colleague of mine might be struggling with suicidal ideation. How can I approach this conversation with them? So we have Christina to introduce. I want to introduce Christina, but I want us to hold this question because I certainly have some thoughts about it, and I would imagine everyone on the panel has some thoughts about how to approach this kind of conversation. So I want to hold this. I just want to recognize that we have the question, and then also I want to say, Debbie, another thing that's really striking for me is, especially in tech, and so I work mostly in tech, and especially in tech, we're always talking about bring your whole self to work. Bring your whole self to work. Well, you know what? My whole self might also include my mental health challenges. They might include my anxiety. They might include my depression. They might include my suicidal ideation. They might include my bipolar. They might include my neurodivergence. They might include, my family history. So they might include like all kinds of things. And so if we're really going to have people bringing their whole self to work, I don't think it can just be the celebratory parts.
No, you can't. Hard to leave those things at home. Absolutely right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Demi, for bringing your whole self to work and for sharing it with us here. All right, so our last person on our panel, but definitely not least, is Christina. So Christina, I know you're in construction, and I have to say, on Labor Day of this year, I was with a friend, visiting a friend. I was supposed to be on vacation, visiting a friend in Mendocino. The boyfriend of her next door neighbor, 50 feet away from us, on the evening of Labor Day, uh, pulled out a gun and took his life in front of his girlfriend with their children in the next room. And it was, I mean, just a trauma-inducing experience for everyone. He worked in construction. You could sort of see, my friend said, she'd see him going back and forth to work every day. Just, never any sign. But he was constantly saying to his girlfriend, that he wished that he would just wasn't here anymore, that he wished he would just die. And then he ultimately took his life. As I'm understanding, construction is disproportionately plagued with suicide, and you're, kind of pushing a stone uphill and it just keeps rolling down, and you push it up again and it rolls down. So can you talk a little bit about, I think there's a process that you have that's called QPR training: question, persuade, refer. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of how you approach this in a sector where it's a male dominated sector, it's plagued with suicide? Can you just talk a little bit about sort of how you approach this?
Yeah, and you're right. We are unfortunately disproportionately plagued by suicide. But geographically, or not geographically, but statistically, it's middle-aged white men who tend to take their lives most frequently, and that tends to be the demographic of construction. It's a tough stigma to break down within our industry, and so yeah, we do have found ourselves that it's like one step forward, two steps back, and trying to start these conversations. And you mentioned QPR, and certainly that's not ours, but it's something that we use. It's a tool that we use. It's a training, stands for question, persuade, and refer. And in a nutshell, it is a suicide prevention course, but in practice, it's really a lesson in empathy, and it's a way for us to be able to help individuals in our organization identify those who may be struggling, some of the warning signs, like some that you just mentioned. And then not only once you identify them, but then what do you do about it? How can you start those conversations, and giving them tricks and tips on how to do that and how to get people to open up? And then lastly, how to get them to help. Because that's one of the biggest questions, and we already saw it in the chat. So one of the easiest tips that we give people is to call 988, and it doesn't have to be you that's struggling. Call 988 on behalf of someone. How do I help this person? Absolutely, that's what they're there for. And if they're there with you, encourage them to jump on the line with you to kind of start that conversation and make them feel like you're there for them. But that's one of the easiest things that we do through the course of that class, is teach people how to support people through that, how to be there with them and provide those kind of little nuggets of hope that get them through. And through the years of us doing this, we just started QPR about a year ago, and all of our supervision and leadership are required to take this course. And then we've seen just so many dramatic changes in our industry alone in the last few years. People are now asking for services, and even subcontractors who don't work for us directly but work on our job sites have called our superintendents asking for help, because I heard you talk about this and I have a guy who's struggling. I know that you know how to get me help. And that's just really powerful, because a few years ago they wouldn't have had that. They didn't have anyone to reach out to. And so yeah, it gives me goosebumps kind of thinking about that it's definitely starting to change the industry, and we're seeing a little bit of a shift, which is great.
That's amazing. So that we're often seeing that be the change you want to see kind of kind of guidance, and it does sound like your organization is being that change, and folks are seeing that and calling out for, hey, can you help support us? Can you help us think about this? So I want to pull two takeaways I saw from you, because I think they also speak to some of the questions in the chat. Number one is the question, persuade, refer is a framework and a training, it sounds like, that's available to others. So perhaps we can, work with the This Can Happen folks to, get people information about that. If you'd like to bring that to your own organization, it sounds like that could be a possibility for you, especially because I saw here in chat, there's a question about, how do you actually talk about this in a way that legal is going to allow in your organization? Because some organizations can't talk about this because of liability. There's sort of a lot of concern about liability. So perhaps doing something like formal training would be incredibly helpful for that liability, because there's liability both ways, right? There's liability if you do something and it causes injury to someone, but there's also liability if you do nothing and someone is sort of left with no support. So perhaps that formal training. And then I also really appreciate, because I bet you there are other folks who didn't know about the 988 number. So just simply picking up the phone and dialing 988, not just if you are in crisis, but if you know someone who's in crisis, they can actually maybe help get you some formal guidance for how to be a better resource for folks. So hopefully that's helpful for some of the questions in chat, which are really right now all about, how do I have this conversation sensitively? How do I have this conversation effectively? How do I have this conversation legally? What guidance would you offer if the team is impacted? So I'm going to, any one of those questions, I think, folks here have lots of guidance. So I want to start with, actually, Gavin, I want to start with you if you have any contribution you'd like to make to some of these questions.
Sure, I have a few thoughts on some of these questions. First off, if you are interested in QPR training, I also recommend it. It is, you can go to qprinstitute.com. It is $30, so pretty cheap, and it is a 1-hour training, and your certification remains active for 2 years. So it's definitely something I've seen utilized by multiple organizations, including one I'm involved in.
And Gavin, just really quick, so I can do that as an individual. I don't need to wait for my organization to sign on to do that. I can just do that on my own.
Anyone can go online. It's a virtual QPR. Well, the primary QPR training I'm aware of is the QPR online gatekeeper training done by the QPR Institute. There are other trainings out there, but that one I'm aware of, and anyone can go online and do it for a one-time cost of $29.95. I just pulled it up on their website. Beyond that, I wanted to talk a little bit about legal blocking things because I am a lawyer and because I am the wellness director of a law firm. And in particular, I am the wellness director of a labor and employment law firm.
So you might be slightly qualified to talk about this, Gavin, just slightly.
Well, all I'll say is they hired me as their wellness director, and I am talking about this stuff all the time. And literally within the first, I think, month of my time as wellness director of this firm, I recorded a video introducing myself to the firm where I told my entire story, including a in-detail discussion of my near death by suicide. So I can tell you that these things are possible. And if your legal team internally is worried about liability, maybe reach out to Jackson Lewis. We are a labor and employment firm, and you can hire us to advise you and give some counsel on what the actual liability risks are. Because I think you'll find that lawyers get nervous about this, but they do so without having done much actual research into what the actual liability risks are, especially as more and more research is coming out showing and pretty conclusively proving that the more you talk about suicide, the less likely people are to actually attempt or die by suicide. And the old myth was, right, that if you even say the word suicide, someone's going to be like, "Ooh, that's a great idea." But obviously, that's just not how it works. And a lot of science and data-backed research has been coming out within the past 5 years or so, very much sort of evidencing that that is not the case. The more you talk about it, the less likely people are to do it because they feel comfortable enough to discuss not only their thoughts and feelings, but the underlying issues, the underlying reasons that they're feeling the way they do. In terms of I'm looking.
Well, you don't have to answer all of them, Gavin, because we're gonna actually I want to get Brian and because I know you, like you are a fun, and this is actually what I want to say. No, this is what I want to say too. I know I'm available to anyone who wants to follow up further about this. My email is luca@empoweredengineers.com. You can absolutely feel free to reach out to me directly. I have a feeling my colleagues are also equally available and ready to follow up. So please don't think that this is the end of the conversation. If your question doesn't get answered, or if you didn't ask your question here, you can reach out. I'm happy to facilitate questions getting out to various folks and connecting people directly. So please know that we're available for you to help you think this through in your organization and with your teams. But yeah, so I just want to give actually Debbie and Brian a chance to speak to. Brian, particularly, I'd like to speak to you the question about creating psychological safety. There's a question in the chat about how can I create an environment of psychological safety where employees feel comfortable speaking about these sensitive subjects. I think the military is a place where, if we can create environmental psychological safety there, we can create psychological safety anywhere. So, any thoughts that you would want to share? And then also, Christina, if you'd want to get in on that one too, because I think that's the same with the construction industry, where there's a lot of emotional reserve and sort of like emotional distance between folks in these topics. So how would you create psychological safety, and what would you share about that?
Thank you so much, Luca. That is a powerful question and something that really needs to be addressed. From my personal experience and the things that I've dealt with the department, the best way to address that immediately is exactly what Gavin said earlier, is that for someone in a leadership position to be brave and stand in front of people in an appropriate situation and say, I have been there and I've done these things. I, at one point, was thinking about suicide and I got counseling. And if you are ever in a place where you are thinking about suicide, I want you to know that you can come to me and we can talk about it. That is probably the most profound, impactful way that you can change the environment around you and in your organization for at least that one conversation that you will have with the individual who may be thinking about suicide or behavioral health in any way, mental health in any way. So if a person is struggling with bipolar disorder, they know that there's stigma associated with mental health. And if you have said before them, I'm on medication for X, then they know that you're safe to go to. So that is the primary way to start that conversation. And let me just interject one more thing. I think the best way to address somebody who is thinking about suicide, the best way to initiate that conversation is just to be you, to be genuine, and to be compassionate. Walk up to that individual and say, I have noticed that you are struggling, or I heard that you're going through this. And a lot of people who do those things often think about suicide. And I want you to know that that's okay. And I'm here to talk to you about it. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And that is probably the best, most profound, most effective way to initiate those conversations. So I handle two aspects of that, and I don't want to get too broad because we don't have a lot of time. But that is probably the most effective way to initiate a discussion and make people feel like it is safe to say, I have been there and I'm okay. And so are you.
Yeah. And I think, I would sum that up, Brian, by saying, I have been there. I came through it. If you're there, I'm here for you. Like that would be the message that is the message that I have delivered many, many times in terms of coaching folks and connecting with folks. And I also appreciate you mentioned leadership. There's sort of like that formal leadership of an organization. But I think also a lot of us know that there are people who are like the cultural leaders of an organization. They may not be, the executive leadership or the, senior management, but they're also the culture carriers of the organization. They're people who've been with the organization a long time, or people who have influence and folks know they have influence. Getting those folks involved too can be very, very powerful. So Christina, did you have anything to add in terms of how to support a team, or particularly if there's suicide in the workplace, how do you actually, and you're kind of on a team where someone committed suicide, how would you, what's some of the good ways to support your team?
Yeah, and that's a great question, especially if you haven't been there, and hopefully you're never there. But one of the things that we are a part of locally is we've partnered with the local branch of 988, so the local suicide prevention line, and brought along others in the construction industry to form a partnership. And with that partnership, we've created a lot of educational materials, and some of that is preparing a post-vention process. Post-vention meaning if an event of suicide were to occur. How do you support your team? How do you support the individuals who are closest, who may have been there, all those sort of things. So having that in place is really important. Knowing who you're going to call, counselors to bring on site, that sort of thing, is really important, because in the moment, it's, even the best of us get rattled, and we may not know exactly what to do. But having that plan in place ahead of time is really important. So that's something great that's come out of that partnership, is some of those planning materials. And just to kind of piggyback, I think one of the main things, like we talked about, middle-aged white men being the key demographic, unfortunately, and societally, they're the least oppressed individuals, right? But I would argue that internally, they're probably the most oppressed individuals, because the stigma around mental health in white men specifically is not to talk about it, to just deal with it, to tough it out, strong arm it, right? Which is all very coincides well with construction. So that's been one of the things that we've had to kind of meet them where they're at and help them understand that, you don't have to tough these things out. And we do these QPR trainings. It's not just me, because, who am I, a girl sitting in an office talking about well-being? I bring someone from the field with me, someone who is their partner in arms, who they can relate to, who helps do those trainings, because that really helps them open up when they see someone they can relate to, someone who's been there, their brother, their partner, along the side in the trades. That makes a difference.
Yeah, and I can imagine, like in a sector like yours, like the peer support is really important. Like that's awesome that there's this nice lady to help me. But if I can't hear about this in the language that I'm used to, and the sort of from the folks who look like me, if I can't hear about this from you, like how do I know it's real for me? So I think it is important too to be thinking about that peer support. So I hear a couple things. So having that the peer support wherever it's possible. If you know someone who's struggling, if there's someone else you can find who's like them, who can help them from the perspective that they're coming from. And then also that postvention, that's really important too. I don't think that that's something we hear very often, having a postvention plan. So being really clear about sort of what would we do if something like this happened. I don't think I've ever, and I think I'm going to take this back to my own organization, I don't think I've ever heard of an organization having a plan for, hey, what would we do if someone in our org took their life? Like, what would we do for the team? I think everything is like super reactive. So having that post-vention plan, I think, would be really important. Harsha, I see your question in chat about repeat the website. I'm not sure who that's directed at. So who is it that you like? Who do we need to repeat the website? If you can just put that in chat, that'd be helpful. And then Debbie, I think I want to. Which website though is what I'm asking. What sort of what was the conversation? I'm just not quite sure where we were in the conversation. While we're getting that sorted, one thing I want to say is there is a downloadable contacts list in the event help desk for folks to download. You can access support and help. Hopefully our contact is in there, but again, my email is Luca, Luca @Empowered Engineers, and you can always feel free to reach out to me directly. Debbie, I want to actually kind of come back to the question of psychological safety at work and how to address that. How do they do that where you work?
Well, again, as everybody has mentioned, just having the discussion, putting it out there on the internet site, mental health awareness and suicide awareness, that really does a lot to. At least it did a lot for me to let me know that the company is very committed to a culture that respects mental health and suicide. And I think, as others have mentioned too, the more it's talked about, that helps reduce the stigma. Stigma has been reduced quite a bit over the last 25 years, but we obviously still have a long way to go.
And I want to speak to this too, the stigma. I want to speak to this as a woman of color, particularly around for underrepresented folks. I have certainly heard talking about mental health and talking about things like suicide. That's white people can do that safely, but those of us who are, underrepresented, we're in more vulnerable positions, right? And I certainly respect that. I really do, having come from that position myself. Again, I do think that that's why it is important for us to ensure that all kinds of people are talking about suicide prevention. All kinds of people are talking about it. So, Christina, I actually really appreciate your point. White men don't get to have problems in this country, right? Because of the conversations around entitlement and privilege. But I do think that it's important for and sort of incumbent upon us who really believe in mental health and mental well-being that all kinds of people need support, and so all kinds of people get to talk about their mental health challenges and sort of bring those challenges to the fore. And so I just want to make sure that we're just so putting that out there and stating it very explicitly that mental health is not sort of the domain or the purview of one group or another. All of us have the potential for these challenges, and all of us need support and should be able to support each other. Gavin, did you have actually something that you wanted to add around that, or sort of in relation to that?
Yeah, specifically both in relation to what you were just saying, Luca, and in relation to the concept of peer support, which Christina had brought up. I am involved in a couple peer support organizations, and it's something that I strongly believe in. As you said, there are lots of reasons why someone won't talk to another person, whether they're not like them, not from the same background, not having any shared experience. And even more problematically, sometimes when the word suicide is mentioned, right, certain processes are immediately enacted, that certain triggers are pulled and the levers start moving, and we have to be aware all of these things. So a organization that I really appreciate, and I've gone through their actually 30-hour training, is Wildflower Alliance. And they are formerly the Western Massachusetts Recovery Learning Center. They're an organization primarily funded by the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. And they run peer support meetings, non-clinical peer support meetings, specifically for people currently experiencing or who have experienced suicidal ideation, to come and freely be able to talk about suicide and the desires to end one's life or harm oneself in any way without the fear that they will be involuntarily hospitalized, involuntarily medicated, or be in a room where they're talking with a group of people who have no idea what that experience is like. So it's a really powerful organization and a powerful space. And something I strongly believe in is that peer support angle. And I'm grateful to you as well, Luca, for mentioning that for people from underrepresented and historically excluded communities, while the rates of suicide are lower, we are starting to see, and I can tell you the research in law is coming out as we speak. Literally, I was on a call earlier today reviewing a report that's going to be coming out of Massachusetts on lawyer mental health and wellness. And on pretty much every mental health metric, folks from BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and other marginalized identities have significantly worse mental health outcomes than others. I agree that nationally the suicide rate, and it's really interesting the divergence between admitting to mental health issues or mental illness versus actually enacting suicide. And you're right, the enacting suicide is still primarily white men, but it's really interesting that we do need to acknowledge that different people have different backgrounds, different lived experiences, and that experiences of bias and discrimination and harm can very much lead someone down a spiral into suicidal ideation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, panel, we are coming to time. We tried to finagle more minutes. Unfortunately, we just couldn't get them because that we could have this conversation for a lot longer now. But as we're coming to time, I'm going to go around and thank each of you. Before I do that, I just want to say I've had a 30-year relationship with my own suicidal ideation. The first time I experienced suicidal ideation, I was 19 years old. I had just come out. I was in the military. I had joined the Air Force, and then I realized I was gay. And I was pretty terrified. And so I decided to end my life. And fortunately, there was nothing in my room that would allow me to do so, sort of expeditiously. And so I didn't at that time. But over the last 30 years, I've really had an evolving relationship with suicidal ideation. I've come to understand that in its own way, it is something that's trying to help me. It's something that's trying to keep me from suffering. It just doesn't have quite the best idea for how to do that. But it is an alarm for me that, that I may be suffering some despair and I need some help. So what I would encourage anyone who's experiencing suicidal ideation, or someone who's experiencing suicidal ideation, recognize that it is a clarion call for help. It's a clarion call for suffering and help in the face of that suffering. And hopefully what we've offered here today can help you help someone else, or help you help yourself. Brian, I want to thank you for bringing the perspective of the military and that sort of cultural shift, and that change is possible. Christina, same with you. Working in a cultural context where suicide is high and continuing to do that good work. I know you're rolling that stone uphill, girl. One of these days, it's going to stick. Hang in there, and we're there with you. Debbie, for bringing new meaning and true meaning to the word authentic, bringing your absolute whole self to work, and allowing that whole self to help others. And Gavin, you're just a font of like all the information. So, thank you for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us, and for being with us. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you again, and hope we continue the good work together. And yes, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luca.